When you travel to another country, you must follow their laws. It's like being a guest at someone else's house. You do not throw your shoes in specific places, and you always wash your hands. However, things do not always go easily. This is also true for some of the most well-known rock and roll bands and performers of all time. Here we'll look at 5 instances in which some of the world's most well-known bands got into problems and were later barred from touring in several Asian countries. You may assume that bands like Led Zeppelin and musicians like Bob Dylan would be immune to a ban, but even they couldn't dodge it entirely. Let's get started below. 1. Led Zeppelin in Singapore. Some of the bands on this list were banned from entering certain countries owing to their own acts. However, the circumstances surrounding Led Zeppelin are almost too ludicrous to mention. Singapore banned men's long hair in the 1960s to combat hippie culture. For a band like Led Zeppelin, this meant they wouldn't be permitted to enter the nation because they had more locks than Goldilocks. The band even came into the country in 1972 to perform, but they were not allowed to leave the plane and were forced to return to England. 2. Rolling Stones in Japan. The Rolling Stones were recognized not only for their successful songs, but also for their drug use. This fact kept the band out of Japan until 1990. Mick Jagger's 2 drug convictions in 1967 and 1970 barred the group from entering the country when they were at their peak, in 1973. When they were ultimately permitted in, the band performed 10 sold-out gigs at the Tokyo Dome, grossing $30 million in 2 weeks. Everything seems to have been worth the wait. 3. The Beatles in Philippines. You'd think the Beatles, the world's largest band, would be welcome wherever, and could name the stages where they were scheduled to perform. However, the trio was barred from performing in the Philippines after unwittingly disrespecting the country's First Lady. Locals rebelled against the former Mop Tops, who had to repay their concert expenses and were never welcomed again. The band had performed 2 gigs in Manila in front of 80,000 people, but when they failed to properly acknowledge the First Lady, they were doomed. 4. Bob Dylan in China. Bob Dylan was scheduled to perform in Shanghai and Beijing in 2010, but the gigs were cancelled when Chinese officials expressed worries about his rebellious, even anti-authoritarian lyrical style. It's surprising they weren't aware of this ahead of time. Dylan was eventually admitted into the nation the following year, in 2011, after granting the country permission to pre-approve his set list. 5. Bon Jovi in China. Government officials halted gigs scheduled in China for the New Jersey rock band in 2015. While the reason was not officially mentioned, the BBC reported that the Wanted Dead or Alive group was disbanded when Chinese censors discovered the band had used a photograph of the Dalai Lama as a backdrop for one of their shows some years before. The Dalai Lama is the top spiritual leader in Tibet, which China occupies.